Thank you, Giulia, Max, and Carla, for getting me to come over, inviting me to come and present this. This is I'm originally from Zimbabwe, but I now work in Denmark. I've worked in the Netherlands, where we did this study at the University of Wageningen, with one of the speakers, with one of the audience present here, Bas van Vliet, Gert Spagaren, and colleagues from the University of Makerere. That's Tony Sekamate, Doreen Nakire, John Bosco Isunju, and Richard Mugambe. And today's presentation is mainly an empirical presentation, trying to give a snapshot of the kind of vulnerabilities that can emerge at the water, energy, food nexus in informal settlements in Kampala, but also the opportunities for building resilience at the same time where these vulnerabilities can emerge. This case study is from a project called the WEF Nexus project, which was a collaboration between SPRU, Sussex University, Saurabh Aurora and Fiona Marshall, and Ralitza Hiteva, but also colleagues from Brazil. They also had their own case in Guarulhos. That was Professor Pedro Jacobi, Leandro Giamatti, and other colleagues. So, is it moving? Good.
Yes.
So I'll just walk through a short introduction on, why cities matter when we look at transitions, and that's something that's already been talked about, but just touch upon that. But then more importantly, what urban informality is, and give a brief overview into Kampala. I'll look at, why look at the WEF Nexus, the water, energy, food nexus, and social practices. I'll look at the WEF Nexus project, give a brief overview of our ideas, our hypothesis, methods, and the fieldwork that we did. Then we'll look at the results of looking at the vulnerabilities and resilience building practices that we found were happening in 2 informal settlements in Kampala. And lastly, we'll tie it up with looking at what the implications of these findings could be for governing the water, energy, food nexus in informal settlements. And the basic guiding question, even though the title is, what could go wrong with cooking, the basic guiding question is, how does a social practice perspective on the WEF Nexus, looking at cooking, help us identify vulnerabilities and opportunities for resilience for just transitions in Kampala? First of all, as most of us will know, since 2008, cities have become the primary urban form or primary human settlement form around the world. So not just cities, but other types of urban settlements. So it can be small towns and such. And cities are quite important as we are in the era of climate change. They account for a lot of the global emissions that we have. But they're also complex hybrids of socio-ecological and technological systems, structures, and processes. They concentrate populations and infrastructures on the one hand. A lot of them are quite vulnerable to climate change impacts. They're also hubs for production, consumption, and innovation. And lastly, within the urban transition, sustainability transitions field, urban sustainability transitions or transformations are a key focus, looking at the work of Wolfram, Francis Kaki, and the research agenda set by Kula et al. And why informal settlements? So it's one thing to look at cities, but why concentrate on informal settlements? And we looked at informal settlements because as cities have become the primary form of human settlement, within cities since 2000, we've had a population of 1 billion people, 27% of cities living in slums. And by 2050, it's projected that almost 50% of people in the global south cities will be living in informal settlements. And of course, yes, there is thinking about whether to call them informal settlements and the kind of semantics that go with that. What are informal settlements? So they are usually found in post-colonial cities, such as African cities or sub-Saharan cities. They are characterized by infrastructure deficits, usually a lack of sanitation and water and sanitation infrastructure, illegal electricity connections. They are usually also characterized by the lack of deeds or land titles, so some form of illegitimacy. But we need to note that informality it sits on a huge spectrum of what it is. It entails different forms of exclusion and illegitimacy in the city. Informality is often viewed by authorities or city authorities as temporary or transitional, a sort of state of exception. But it does show us the limits of the modern infrastructure ideal, where the idea is that as cities develop or as nations develop, everybody will have access to housing, water, sanitation and hygiene infrastructure, energy infrastructure. So the informality puts that into question. Other characteristics of informal settlements are that they're enmeshed with an informal economy. So they're actually a very key part of the economy of cities in the global south. They act as receiving sites for migrants within countries, but also migrants from outside countries. They are a manifestation of unequal power relations. And as we've said in the beginning, they're often linked to historical exclusionary urban development processes. So they are a legacy of colonialism in many places. And the kind of infrastructure deficits that come with informality then lead to justice deficits. If 60% of the people in the city do not have or live in informal settlements, then we would paint that as a justice deficit. And this is not the first time that we are looking at informal settlements or urbanization in the global south within sustainability transition studies. That's already been done in one way or another by Swiling and Nanek, Lohorn, myself, Ramos Mejia have a seminar article on that, Van Feili, Cherunya, Gosh, and yeah, many other authors. So we move on to Kampala. So this is Kampala, the city of Kampala, a capital city of Uganda, over 120 years ago. I got this slide from Bas. And as you can see, it's a colonial outpost, very little development. Well, not much you can see in a black and white color photo, but it's a very leafy and temperate place. And speaking to the segregation that comes with colonialism and how informality is bred, Kampala is part of many African cities that began or it developed with segregation infrastructure as a logic. So you have in the center, you have the modern sanitary area, which houses Europeans. And then there's a buffer zone in between, and then in the outer edges you have the African areas, which were already informal and were not served by modern sanitation or sewer systems. This is also another slide from Bas. And that infrastructure division persists. And this is not only for Kampala. You will find it when you look at South African cities and many other cities that divide between areas that are serviced by water or energy and sewerage infrastructure. There is a difference between those areas and the areas that are designated as informal. You can see that on the left, that's a formally provisioned area. And on the right, you have an infilling of informal areas. But that's not to say the city of Kampala is not doing anything right now. They've been very busy over the past decades with policies, multi-sector policies to upgrade and try and deal with informal settlements. They have policies and budgets dedicated to upgrading informal settlements, trying to bring in public participation. The blue-green infrastructure mapping and protection. They have programs for food security, mobility programs for upgrading the water and sanitation infrastructure, and also embracing smart city approaches. So what was interesting for us to then use the water energy food nexus. And what is the water energy food nexus? So the water energy food nexus looks at cross-sector and cross-scale interactions between water, energy, and food. It's an environmental policy program that analyzes the mutual vulnerability that can emerge when water, energy, and food come into play, as well as the potential for distributing the benefits and synergies from that. The main studies, or to begin with, a lot of studies focused on the micro scale, the bigger scale, looking at huge resource flows and efficiency therein. But there was a shortage of studies that were looking at, the disconnections that can happen between food, water, and energy, which lead people to become vulnerable. And emphasis on infrastructure fixes would often fail, and those can also resist scaling up and can produce unintended consequences. And this big framing of the nexus had limited insights into the power and agency of how people can be enabled to support more resilient outcomes, but also how people become vulnerable at the water, energy, food nexus. And yes, the big framing of the nexus obscures the day-to-day community and household nexus interactions that make up the nexus at the bottom, in sort of a locally grounded abstractions of it. And when you look at the nexus from a bottom-up perspective, you start to see issues that go beyond resource security. You start to see issues of availability, access to resources, their distribution, and how they are utilized by locals. So our hypothesis was that if we looked at social practices, user social practices at the domestic level, we would be able to have or give sight to policy-led interventions from the institutional level to just show them what is happening at the local level and how the water, energy, food nexus comes together or falls apart for those who are considered the most vulnerable in the city of Kampala. And why look at social practices? It was one way to counteract the big framing or techno-managerial framing of the water, energy, food nexus. It was also a way to get a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between the different aspects of the nexus. And within practices, everyday life is defined and characterized by the rise and transformation and disintegration of social practices. And we took, within social practice theory, there's different traditions. We took both Elizabeth Shove, but also Theodore Shatsky's ideas of social practices, in which Shove says practices are made up of competencies, meanings, and materials. And I think she also has a video already on the NESTwebinar series that the audience can look into. And social practices refer to, everyday practices and the way in which these practices are typically and habitually performed by most of societies. Practices include things like going to work, cooking, and showering, and they are meaningful parts of people's everyday lives. So, seeing the WEF Nexus from the social practice view, the social practices direct attention to the shared and routinized and embedded nature of everyday practices around the nexus. The consumption practices and the way the water, energy, food provisioning services or systems are part of these same practices. They mutually reproduce each other. And connections between the water, energy, and food nexus are being reconstructed through performances of multiple social practices that incorporate these three resource flows. In Kampala, we decided to focus on cooking as a WEF practice because cooking brings together water, energy, and food, these three resource flows, quite neatly. And we decided to look at cooking as a social practice. So the competencies, so doing cooking properly, what does it take to cook matoke, which is a local plantain, properly in Kampala, in an informal settlement in Kampala? What does it look like to cook it right? And what does it look like to cook it successfully, to actually be able to prepare a meal? And as you can see on the top left picture, we have two different types of stoves that are in use in Kampala's informal settlements. So a tin sigiri, the stoves are called sigiri, where people put in charcoal at the bottom. And then in the middle, you have a clay sigiri with the same sort of logic, that people would put in charcoal and light it up to cook. And on the right, you have, in the same picture, you have a bucket of charcoal. In the top right of that picture, we have one of our ladies that we interviewed, that we shadowed, and that's Florence. So our case areas were Boise in the northwest of Kampala. That's an informal settlement in the northwest of Kampala. And Kanyogoga, which is in the southeast of Kampala. We focused on 10 vulnerable households, shadowing females were aged between 22 to 77 years in both areas. And fieldwork was done between June 2017 and June 2018 at different periods. And we shadowed each woman as she cooked, but also shadowed her as she went to look for water for cooking, but also the energy that she would use to cook. And these shadowing episodes would be 3 to 4 hours a week. We got videos and photos from it. We also engaged in focus group discussions with both groups. We had semi-structured interviews with city authorities, NGOs, ministries, utilities. And then finally, we had a vision building workshop in September 2017 involving the same community members that we had been shadowing, but also water, energy, food governance practitioners, civil society, and researchers. And now I will go into our findings. First of all, when looking at water consumption and provisioning practices, so within the water, energy, food nexus in both these areas, water was the least problematic of the resources for all the households. There were different types of water that people used. It was widespread and free. You had, first of all, had widespread and free, but not so safe spring and well water that everybody had access to. And this was because animal shelters and pit latrines and frequent flooding sometimes served as a source of contamination for these free water sources. In some households, there were barriers to following drinking water quality guidelines. Charcoal was thought to be too expensive to boil. We also found that there was a reuse of water for different tasks, from higher order uses to lower order uses. So water that you would use to wash plates could then be used to wash clothes and such. And we also found, as you can see in the bottom left picture, there was also a question of what kind of trajectory are there for water system transitions in Kampala's informal settlement, because the one person who had a standpipe installed at her place had to get it shut down because she couldn't afford it. She couldn't afford the cost of 80,000 shillings to keep her standpipe running. And then moving on to energy. So there were different sources of energy that the households could tap into. There was charcoal, which is the normal source of energy, but there were also briquettes, which is a more sort of sustainable source of energy, which mixes charcoal with other biomass, but also with flour and other things that are available to make for a longer lasting burn. And we found that rising charcoal prices had a huge impact on water, energy, food practices, or not only cooking, but also boiling. And there was a lot of substitution for charcoal going on with firewood. Some were burning old clothing. Those who lived close to a furniture workshop were getting timber offcuts from that furniture workshop. There were these briquettes that I've already mentioned, but there was a low uptake of these supposedly sustainable briquettes. And this was partly due to a lack of materials or inaccessible machinery for making these charcoal briquettes, but also a lack of awareness. And when times were really hard, households could borrow charcoal from charcoal traders, local charcoal traders, or give their neighbors their pots for their neighbors to cook their food for them, which we called borrowing a hearth. And sometimes, if they were in good terms with the charcoal traders, they could also sort of harvest the leftover charcoal chips from the charcoal heaps and used those. And we found that energy poverty was the weakest link in the nexus, in the water energy food nexus, in Kampala's informal settlements. And the last flow was looking at food consumption and provisioning practices. There were different approaches to provisioning food. So you can see on the left we have a lady, Rose. She was cultivating a nearby plot in a nearby wetland where she would get some of her fresh food. Other sources of provisioning were buying from local traders, as well as donations from neighbors. And one thing that we found was that all the households reported some form of rising food insecurity. Some were ending up having single meals per day. And urban agriculture was used as a way of coping with the food insecurity, although lack of land and the risk of bioaccumulation of metals in food was a risk. And when food insecurity was really deep, there was a prioritization of children over adults in terms of access to food. So some mothers would let their children eat instead of them, and just for the day to be done. And there was also, because of the kind of priciness or costliness of charcoal, there was now a change in menus as well. More and more people were reporting that they were cooking faster cooking foods like greens and not beans, even though those would be, often lower nutritional value. And greens in this case means anything from kale and such. And this was all in an attempt to conserve energy. And some of the thoughts, I just thought I'd throw this in, but some of the thoughts on the different resource flows on energy. We had one lady saying charcoal is the problem. There are days when we have enough food, but not enough money to buy charcoal. So on those days, we don't eat. We give bread to the children. And then on food, we also had someone say, I do not like cooking beans. Sometimes they take too long and consume a lot of energy. Greens cook faster. And then a quote from the one lady who had a city standpipe, or a formal water standpipe, and how she got it shut down was that I used to have a yard tap, but I called them to come and disconnect it as I could not afford 80,000 shillings a month. Now we just get our water from Nabukalu well instead. And from these results, we put together a paper, and in that we adapted the consumption provisioning structure agents theory or view from Sparharen, and before that from Giddens, to talk about precarious consumption, because that was the one thing that was clear for us, that although there are many forms of provisioning, many systems of provisioning on the one hand, provisioning water, energy, and food, their consumption was based on a lot of, was modulated by many things, preferences, prospects, livelihoods, having enough money to actually buy said resources. And we then talked about the idea of precarious consumption. So not just consumption, but precarious consumption as a mode or as a dynamic of producing vulnerability in informal settlements in Kampala. So on the making of vulnerability, like I've just said, precarity emerged as a key dynamic of vulnerability at the water energy food nexus. Points of vulnerability and resilience are often emergent in these contexts, and the mediation of synergies versus trade-offs at the WEF Nexus is linked to many things, such as social capital, continued access to the different system of water, energy, food provisioning. And insecure livelihoods made poverty a cross-cutting issue. And yes, energy poverty was the weakest link in the domestic nexus, prompting changes in the ecologies of practice that surround cooking. So less boiling of water that that most people were not sure was safe enough to drink. And that coping with vulnerability involved dipping into social capital, so these ethics of proximities, neighbors, vendors, fellow Muslims, or fellow church mates. We also so we also saw something to do with gender and the intersection of gender and vulnerability. And one of my good friends who's here, Ellen, talked me through this as well. And this was due to the idea of gendered labor as women took up the role of water, energy, food provisioning, and sometimes going without eating in times of scarcity. And that although vulnerability at the water, energy, food nexus could be about these different resource flows, it was actually the basis for that vulnerability came from the idea of informality, that the lack of access to housing and titles and infrastructures remains a basis of how vulnerability is constructed. And within that, the transience of the vulnerable community is also a dynamic that mediates policy impact. We have a quote right there from one of the KCCA interviewees where she says, the problem is that when we successfully implement pro-poor infrastructure in informal areas, we find that the poor are pushed out to other unserviced areas as they have no title to the land. So the problems begin yet again. The other thing we found about the making of vulnerability was that there were several contradictions at the water, energy, food nexus. So an illegal electricity connection is cheaper than charcoal, but is unsafe during floods, the risk of electrocution and such. That there was defection from safe water supply sources due to cost. Another contradiction is that free spring water was good enough. You would have higher energy costs though. And that clean tap water meant that there was lower energy use, but there was a decrease in income available for food and energy purchase. And on the building of resilience, we found that the city and government upgrading programs were quite robust and quite responsive, even if they were overwhelmed. There was a use of solid waste to make briquettes from an animal feed. Engaging with urban agriculture was one form of emergent resilience. The strong communal ties that you find in informal settlements, community saving schemes, the borrowing of food, charcoal, and a hearth, those represented emergent resilience, from the community perspective. And then that NGOs also played a big role in building capacity and innovation uptake. So the briquettes, what you have in this photo is one of the NGOs training the local women in making charcoal briquettes. So what are the implications for governance? So first of all, that integrative rather than silo thinking at the WEF in water, energy, food service provision is key. Maybe suspending the modern infrastructure ideal and allowing for socio-technical mixtures or modernized mixtures, as some of my colleagues would call them, or hybrids. But also that reducing options for accessing resources risked worsening vulnerability. So if you closed up springs and wells, and just said, piped water is the safest water option, that is what people will drink, you could actually worsen vulnerability for those who cannot afford to pay for piped water. We also found that vulnerability was dynamic across time and space, and therefore also demands responsive and dynamic policy making, and that there is a difference between vulnerable people and vulnerable places, because the most vulnerable are usually transient. They usually don't own even those patches of land that they are on right now. We also found that by using social practices to look at the water, energy, food nexus, you could start to see counterintuitive spaces for policy intervention. For instance, by intervening in energy provision to address energy poverty, you would then be supporting safer access to water, because people can then boil their water, have more opportunities for boiling water, spring water, but also allowing increased food security by allowing people to be able to eat more nutritious foods, which would be which would take a bit more energy to cook, like beans. And lastly, that city governments need to facilitate and adopt the lived practices of resilience building that are taking place at the community level. So these, the daily survival strategies that depend on a diversity of water, energy, food options, those need to be taken into account. And as a conclusion, as a running conclusion, so what could go wrong with cooking? Many things could go wrong with cooking if you're in an informal settlement. There's the idea of getting enough space to cook, getting enough food to cook, what to cook, who will cook. So there's skills and competencies that are needed for that. How to cook it, but also when to cook it. And we look at the idea that informal urbanization is a dominant urban typology in the global south. So that is something that we can't run away from. And that means that we have vulnerable populations, but also vulnerable places that need to be addressed, and that the modern infrastructure ideal does not seem to be holding. In fact, informality seems to be rising. In many cities, you have at least, in Kampala, it's 60% of the population lives in informal settlements. Another thing is that rather than focusing on silos of water, energy, and food provision, though the urban water, energy, food nexus could be used as a unit of analysis for urban sustainability transitions to get a fuller picture of what's happening. And yes, social practices help us to see from the bottom up versus top down, and they could help make policy making a bit more tractable and provide some building blocks for wider systemic resilience across the city. And they also have something to say about how we look at the assessments of the realization of SDGs and how they are framed. So perhaps going beyond the usual metrics about accessing, that access to safe water means access to piped water. And yes, we've talked about opening up counterintuitive spaces for policy intervention. So for clean water, perhaps you need to address energy poverty instead. And then they start to give us a view into the potential trajectories and pathways of sustainability transitions in southern cities. The ideas of off-grid trends, intermittency of infrastructures, but also directionality. So if some of our respondents or shadowies were defecting from piped water supply, for instance, what does that say about the direction of the urban water transitions, for instance, in the global south? And lastly, they also have, we have something to say about what do just urban sustainability transitions look like in post-colonial cities. So we don't have the answer for this, but we're just saying that we are providing a snapshot of how life is being lived in some of the vulnerable areas in one city, which is Kampala, and perhaps we can start to sort of see what just urban transitions could look like from there. And I agreed with Mapula that I would talk a little bit about, reflect a little bit about research in vulnerable contexts. So that's my last slide. But yes, there is something about the ethics of research with vulnerable populations. So yeah, we had to wait 2-3 months to get to go through the whole ethics process with the University of Makerere. They have a very, very thorough ethics approval process, and they're very, they have a lot of experience with this. And then there was also the question of access, gaining access to the informal settlements. They're not open to outsiders. So that's also a process, forming relationships with our 10 shadowies and such. And then the question also of reflexivity and having to query the assumptions that we made at the beginning. So in the beginning, our hypothesis was we're going to look at how people cook matoke. And when we got to the ground, most people said, oh, matoke are too expensive to cook. We actually make other things, like cassava or ugali for starches instead. And there's also there's also something to say about managing expectations. when we are coming in as researchers, we are not bringing much in terms of material, material improvement. So there is that as well, managing what people can expect from you. But yes, thank you for listening. That is it.